Most people imagine working alone sounds peaceful. No coworkers, no meetings, no interruptions. Just silence. But for some people, that silence eventually became the worst part of the job. Tonight, we'll look at 4 disturbing stories from people whose work required them to spend long periods completely alone. And for each of them, something happened that they were never able to properly explain. Daniel accepted the fire lookout position because he wanted to get away from people. The job sounded simple. For 4 months each year, he would live alone in a fire observation tower overlooking thousands of acres of forest. His responsibilities were straightforward. Watch for smoke, report weather conditions, log anything unusual. Most days were uneventful. Most nights were even quieter. The tower itself stood on a rocky ridge nearly 40 miles from the nearest town. There was a narrow access road, a radio, a small kitchen, and little else. Daniel arrived in early spring. The previous watcher was already packing his truck when he got there. The handover lasted less than 10 minutes. The older man explained the equipment, showed him where the emergency supplies were stored, handed over the keys, and left. Something about the exchange felt strange. The previous watcher seemed eager to leave. Not happy, not relieved, just finished. At the time, Daniel didn't think much of it. The first 2 weeks passed exactly as expected. Clear skies, routine reports, no fires, no problems. The isolation was actually pleasant. To pass the time, Daniel began reading old lookout records stored inside a cabinet beneath the main desk. The station had been operating for decades. Every watcher left behind notebooks filled with observations. Most entries were painfully boring. Visibility good. No smoke observed. Equipment functioning normally. The same phrases repeated for years. Then Daniel found the most recent notebook, the one belonging to the previous watcher. At first it looked normal. Page after page contained nearly identical entries. Visibility good. Nothing unusual. Visibility good. Nothing unusual. Visibility good. Nothing unusual. For months. Then the wording changed. Visibility good. Still there. Daniel frowned. Still there? What was still there? The next entry said the same thing. Visibility good. Still there. Then another. Rain. Still there. Cloudy. Still there. No explanation. No description. No location. Nothing. Just those 2 words. Still there. The phrase continued for nearly 2 weeks. Then Daniel reached a section where multiple pages had been torn out. Not 1 or 2, nearly 20. The missing pages had been removed carefully. The remaining fragments were still attached to the binding. Whatever had been written, there had been intentionally taken. The next surviving page contained only 1 sentence. I can see it. That was the final entry in the notebook. Nothing after it. No explanation. No conclusion. No farewell. Just, I can see it. Daniel assumed the previous watcher had simply lost his mind from isolation. It wouldn't have been the first time. The station records contained several references to loneliness becoming a problem for long-term workers. He put the notebook away and forgot about it. Or at least he tried to. A few days later, while scanning the forest through binoculars, he noticed something unusual. Far to the northwest, a small opening among the trees. At first it looked completely ordinary. Maybe a clearing. Maybe exposed rock. Maybe nothing. But once he noticed it, he kept looking back. The next day it was still there. And the day after that. And the day after that. Weeks passed. The shape never moved. Never changed. Never disappeared. It simply existed. Yet Daniel found himself checking it more and more often. Eventually, it became the first thing he looked at every morning. Then several times a day. Then every hour. One evening, he opened the old notebook again. This time, he paid attention to the dates. The first "Still There" entry appeared approximately 3 weeks after the previous watcher's arrival. Daniel checked his calendar. He had been in the tower for just over 3 weeks. For the first time, the coincidence bothered him. The next morning, he called the previous watcher. The number was still listed in the station records. To Daniel's surprise, the man answered. After introducing himself, Daniel mentioned the notebook. There was a long silence. Then the older man said, "You found the missing pages." It wasn't a question. Daniel asked what had been written on them. Another silence. What was still there? He asked. No answer. What did you see? The man finally spoke. How long have you been looking at it? Daniel felt a chill. What? How long? A couple of weeks. The line remained silent. Then the older man sighed. Stop looking! Daniel frowned. What is it? It doesn't matter. Then why did you leave? For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, the older watcher answered. It wasn't the thing in the forest. Then he hung up. Daniel stared at the phone. That answer made no sense. It wasn't the thing in the forest. Then what was the problem? That night, he couldn't sleep. The next day, he began reviewing older notebooks, then older ones, then older ones. The deeper he went, the more uncomfortable he became. Different names, different decades, different handwriting. Yet the same pattern appeared repeatedly. Most watchers spent months recording ordinary observations. Then something changed. Short comments began appearing. Didn't sleep much. Barely slept. Strange dreams. Can't stop thinking about it. The wording varied. The pattern did not. And every time the entries appeared shortly before the watcher left the station. Daniel closed the final notebook. For the first time since arriving, he shut the blinds. He avoided the binoculars. He stopped scanning the northwest ridge. He stopped looking altogether. 3 days later, he gave up. His eyes kept returning to the same spot. Not because he wanted to, because he couldn't stop thinking about it. The shape itself wasn't frightening. What frightened him was how much space it occupied inside his mind. By the end of the month, Daniel submitted his resignation. The station manager sounded surprised. His contract wasn't even halfway finished. Daniel didn't try to explain. What explanation could he give? On his final morning, he completed one last entry in the station notebook. Visibility? Good. Nothing unusual. He stared at the sentence for a long time, then added one final line beneath it. I finally understand why they left. For Daniel, the isolation ended when he left the tower. For the next person, the job continued. But unlike a fire watcher, a security guard is supposed to spend his nights around buildings, cameras, and locked doors. At least in theory, he isn't supposed to be completely alone. Compared to his previous assignments, the place seemed ideal. No customers, no employees, no public access. Just a massive distribution center on the edge of an industrial district. The warehouse operated during the day. At night, Marcus was the only person inside. His responsibilities were simple. Walk the property, check the cameras, make sure every access point remained secured until morning. For the first month, nothing unusual happened. Most of his shifts were painfully boring. He spent hours walking empty corridors between storage sections, listening to the hum of ventilation systems and the occasional creak of metal shelving. The building felt abandoned after dark. Miles of empty floor space, rows of stacked pallets, hundreds of silent cameras. Nothing more. Then one morning, just before his shift ended, he noticed something strange. A door in Section D was open. Not wide open, just enough to notice. A few inches. Marcus stopped. That particular door led into an older storage area that was no longer used by the company. The room beyond had been cleared years ago. Nobody was supposed to enter it. He closed the door and continued his rounds. The next night, it was open again. The same amount. The same position. Marcus assumed another guard had forgotten to secure it during a previous shift. He closed it. The following night, it was open again. This time he checked the lock. Nothing wrong. The latch worked perfectly. The frame wasn't damaged. Everything looked normal. Over the next week, the same thing happened every night. Every morning, shortly before his shift ended, he found the door slightly open. Never fully open. Never completely closed. Always the same. At first it was annoying. Then it became unsettling. Marcus reported the issue to management. Maintenance inspected the door. Nothing was found. The lock was replaced anyway. The next morning, the door was open again. Marcus started checking camera footage. The hallway camera had a clear view of the entrance. He reviewed the entire night. Nobody approached the door. Nobody touched it. Nobody even entered the hallway. Yet somehow, when he arrived at sunrise, the door was standing partially open. The footage made no sense. After another week, Marcus decided to conduct his own test. Before starting his patrol, he placed a small strip of tape across the edge of the door. If the door opened, the tape would tear. The next morning, the tape remained intact. The door was open. Marcus stared at it for nearly a minute. That shouldn't have been possible. He removed the tape and entered the unused storage section. The room was empty. Dust covered the floor. Old shelving units lined the walls. Nothing appeared disturbed. Then he noticed a chair. A single metal chair positioned near the center of the room. The chair hadn't been there before. Marcus was certain of it. The room had been completely empty. Now there was a chair. Nothing else. Just a chair. He reported that too. Management assumed someone had moved it from another section. The chair was removed. The following week, the door continued opening. One morning, Marcus entered the room again. The chair had returned. This time, it wasn't in the center. It faced the doorway. He didn't tell management. He wasn't sure why. Part of him knew how ridiculous it sounded. The next night he arrived early. He closed the door, checked the lock, photographed the room, and left. The following morning the door was open again. The chair had moved. Only a few feet. But enough that he immediately noticed. Over the next several weeks, the pattern continued. Every time the door opened, the chair occupied a different position, sometimes facing a wall, sometimes facing the doorway, sometimes angled toward empty shelving. Marcus began comparing photographs. The changes were real. The chair was moving. Slowly, but undeniably. He stopped mentioning it to anyone. No one would believe him. Honestly, he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The warehouse eventually entered its busiest season. Longer shifts, more deliveries, more paperwork. For a while, Marcus almost forgot about the room. Then one night, he noticed something that frightened him far more than the moving chair. The door was closed. For the first time in nearly 2 months, completely closed. Marcus actually felt relieved. Whatever had been happening seemed to be over. He finished his patrols and spent the rest of the night catching up on reports. Just before sunrise, he prepared to leave. As he passed Section D one last time, he noticed the door was still closed. He smiled. Finally. Then he heard something. A single impact. From inside the room. Not loud. Not violent. Just one sharp knock. Marcus froze. A few seconds later, it happened again. Knock. From the other side of the door. He stared at the handle. Waiting. The building remained silent. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing. Just silence. After nearly a minute, Marcus stepped backward. Then another step. Then another. He never opened the door. When the day shift arrived, he submitted his resignation. Management asked why. Marcus simply told them he had found another opportunity. He never mentioned Section D. Years later, he would occasionally think about that warehouse, about the door, about the chair. But mostly, he thought about one question. Why had the knocking only started after the door finally stayed closed? The warehouse was eventually renovated. The old storage section was removed entirely. For Marcus, that chapter of his life ended there. The next person spent his days somewhere far quieter, a place where almost nobody visited anymore. A cemetery. The warehouse was eventually renovated. The old storage section was removed entirely. For Marcus, that chapter of his life ended there. The next person spent his days somewhere far quieter, a place where almost nobody visited anymore. A cemetery. Ethan became the caretaker of St. Bartholomew Cemetery after the previous groundskeeper retired. The cemetery sat on the outskirts of a small town and had been there for over a century. Years ago it had been busy. Now, most local families used a newer cemetery closer to town. Very few burials took place there anymore. Most days, Ethan worked completely alone. His responsibilities were simple: maintain the grounds, trim vegetation, repair damaged markers, keep records. The work was peaceful, at least at first. The first unusual thing happened during his third month on the job. One morning, while making his rounds, he noticed a bouquet of fresh white flowers resting against a grave near the northern fence. The flowers looked new, recently purchased. They couldn't have been there long. Ethan didn't think much about it. Visitors occasionally stopped by. Someone had probably come during the evening. The next morning, he found another bouquet. The same flowers, the same wrapping, the same grave. That caught his attention. Not because flowers were unusual, because nobody had entered the cemetery. The front gate had remained locked. Ethan knew because he opened it himself every morning. He checked the visitor log. Nothing. The security chain around the entrance was untouched. No damage. No sign of forced entry. He removed the flowers and continued working. The following morning, another bouquet appeared. Exactly the same. Placed in exactly the same location. Ethan inspected the perimeter fence. Nothing. No footprints. No broken sections. No evidence anyone had climbed over. Over the next several weeks, the pattern continued. Every morning, a fresh bouquet. Always at the same grave. Always before sunrise. Eventually, Ethan became curious enough to investigate. The grave belonged to a woman named Eleanor Pierce. She had died almost 40 years earlier. The marker was simple. Nothing about it seemed unusual. No local legend, no famous history, no mystery. Just another name among hundreds. Ethan checked old records. The burial files contained very little information. No surviving spouse, no children listed, no recent contact from relatives. As far as he could tell, nobody should have been visiting the grave at all. Yet the flowers kept appearing. One morning, he arrived before dawn. If someone was entering the cemetery at night, he intended to catch them. He parked near the gate and waited. Hours passed. Nothing happened. No vehicles. No footsteps. No movement. When sunrise finally arrived, he unlocked the gate and entered the grounds. The bouquet was already there. Fresh. Perfectly arranged, as if it had been placed during the night. Ethan stood there staring at it. He knew nobody had entered. He had been watching the only entrance for hours. The following week he expanded his search. He inspected nearby roads, spoke to residents living close to the cemetery. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Nobody even knew which grave he was talking about. The mystery slowly turned into an obsession. Then he discovered something that made the situation stranger. While reviewing maintenance records from previous caretakers, he found references to flowers. Not recent references, old ones, very old ones. The same grave had been mentioned repeatedly over the years. Different caretakers, different decades. The notes were brief. Flowers again, flowers at Eleanor's grave. Same flowers. The earliest mention dated back more than 20 years. Ethan sat in silence for a long time after reading that. 20 years. At minimum, possibly longer. The flowers had been appearing long before he started working there. Long before the previous caretaker. Long before most people in town even remembered the woman buried there. For the first time, Ethan considered leaving the issue alone. Maybe the mystery didn't need solving. Maybe it had never been meant to be solved. But curiosity eventually won. One evening he decided to leave a small note beneath the bouquet. A simple question written on folded paper. Who keeps bringing these? The next morning the flowers were there. The note was gone. Ethan searched the area. Nothing, no paper, no reply. No explanation. Just another bouquet. Weeks passed. Summer became autumn. Then one morning, for the first time since Ethan could remember, the flowers were missing. He stopped walking. The grave stood completely empty. No bouquet, no ribbon, nothing. A strange sense of relief washed over him. Finally, whatever had been happening was over. For the rest of the day, he found himself smiling without realizing it. That night, he locked the gate and returned home. The following morning he arrived shortly after sunrise. Something was waiting for him on the front steps of the caretaker's office. A bouquet of white flowers, identical to every bouquet he had removed from Eleanor Pierce's grave. Ethan stared at it, then slowly looked toward the cemetery. The grave in the distance was still empty. For the first time in months, the flowers had appeared somewhere else. He never found out who left them. And after that morning, he stopped trying. For Ethan, the flowers were never explained. The cemetery remained quiet. The grave remained ordinary. And eventually, life moved on. The final story begins in a place filled with records. Thousands upon thousands of them, most forgotten. Some misplaced, and a few that should never have existed at all. For Ethan, the flowers were never explained. The cemetery remained quiet. The grave remained ordinary. And eventually, life moved on. The final story begins in a place filled with records. Thousands upon thousands of them. Most forgotten. Some misplaced. And a few that should never have existed at all. Nathan worked nights in the Municipal Archives building. The city stored decades of paperwork there. Property records, permits, personnel files, tax documents, maps, photographs. Everything that no longer fit inside active government offices eventually ended up in the archives. Most people imagined the work was complicated. It wasn't. It was repetitive. Nathan's job involved organizing records, digitizing old files, and preparing documents requested by various departments. Most nights he worked completely alone. The building closed at 6. After that, only Nathan remained. The archives occupied the basement level of an old government building. Rows of metal shelving stretched through multiple rooms. Thousands of labeled boxes filled the aisles. The system was straightforward. Every box had a catalog number. Every catalog number appeared in the database. Every document had a traceable origin. At least that was how the system was supposed to work. The first anomaly appeared late on a Thursday night. Nathan was reshelving several boxes when he noticed one sitting at the end of an aisle. Plain cardboard. No markings. No catalog label. No department stamp. Nothing. At first, he assumed another employee had forgotten to process it. He carried the box to his desk. Inside were city property records. Nothing unusual. Addresses, inspection reports, ownership forms. The documents looked legitimate. The problem was that none of them existed in the archive database. Nathan searched every system available. Nothing. No record of the box. No record of its contents. No indication it had ever been logged. The next morning he left a note for the day staff. Nobody claimed it. The mystery should have ended there. Instead, the following week another box appeared. Different aisle. Same problem. No label. No catalog number. No database entry. Nathan checked security procedures. Nothing had been delivered overnight. No shipments had arrived. No employees had entered after closing. Yet somehow, another undocumented box had appeared. This one contained old building permits. Again, completely authentic. Again, impossible to trace. By the end of the month, 4 more boxes had appeared. Nathan began keeping his own list. Each box seemed connected to the same part of the city, the same cluster of streets, the same neighborhood. That detail bothered him, because the records themselves were real. The buildings existed. The permits existed. The addresses existed. Only the archive references were missing. One night, he decided to map every address mentioned inside the mysterious boxes. The results surprised him. Almost every document pointed toward the same several blocks near the eastern edge of town. Nathan zoomed in on city planning maps. The neighborhood looked completely ordinary. Residential streets, small businesses. Nothing remarkable. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the documents were trying to tell him something. Weeks later, another box appeared. This time, it was waiting beside his desk when he arrived. For the first time, Nathan felt genuinely uncomfortable. Someone would have needed access to the building. Someone would have needed access to his office. Yet nothing appeared on security reports. No alarms, no entries, no visitors. The box contained personnel records. City employees, dozens of them. Maintenance workers, inspectors, clerks. Most had retired years earlier. Nathan spent several hours examining the files. Everything seemed normal until he reached the bottom. There, beneath the final folder, was another personnel record. His own. Nathan froze. The folder contained accurate information. His full name, date of birth, employee number, hiring date, payroll information. Every detail was correct. He checked the database. The file didn't exist, just like all the others. For several minutes he sat motionless. Then he noticed something else. The department listed on the file wasn't archives. It wasn't any department he recognized. The space where the department name should have appeared contained a single line of text. Records Preservation Division. Nathan had never heard of it. He searched internal directories. Nothing. No department by that name existed. He searched historical organizational charts. Nothing. He checked old budgets.
Nothing.
The division simply didn't exist. Yet according to the file in front of him, he had worked there for nearly 3 years. The following night he stayed late, much later than usual. He wanted answers. Shortly before midnight, he returned to the aisle where the first box had appeared. The archive building was completely silent. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Then he noticed something. A shelf near the back wall. One section appeared empty. That wasn't unusual by itself. What bothered him was the dust. Every shelf nearby was covered with a thin layer, except that one, as if a box had recently been removed. Nathan stepped closer. Attached to the shelf was an old metal location tag. The print had faded with age. He leaned forward and read it. Records, Preservation Division. For several seconds, he simply stared. The tag looked old. Years old. Maybe decades. Yet he had never noticed it before. The shelf behind it was empty. Whatever had once been stored, there was gone. Nathan never found another undocumented box after that night. Not one. The appearances stopped completely. Within a few months, he transferred to a different department. Years later, he still kept a copy of the personnel file hidden in a drawer at home. Every so often, he would take it out and read it again. The information never changed. The signatures remained real. The dates remained accurate. And the department remained exactly the same. Records Preservation Division. A department that, according to every official record he could find, had never existed. Most people spend their lives surrounded by others. Coworkers, friends, family, witnesses. The people in these stories didn't. And perhaps that's why none of them ever found the answers they were looking for. The fire watcher left his tower. The security guard left the warehouse. The caretaker left the flowers alone. And the archivist stopped searching for a department that shouldn't have existed. But none of them ever learned what was really happening. And maybe that was for the best.